Welcome back. I'm David Gura. This past week may mark one of the worst for the Trump White House, with top aide Hope Hicks announcing her decision to leave. But beyond the Oval Office, President Trump's war of words is throwing a wrench in his administration's agenda. Fears of a potential trade war after an impromptu announcement of new tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. An about-face on possible gun legislation after a meeting between the president and representatives of the NRA. And more public feuding between Trump and his own attorney general as Mueller's team investigates efforts to oust Jeff Sessions. Will tomorrow bring more rain for a White House drowning in a political storm of its own making? Joining me now, Brian Darling. He's the president of Liberty Government Affairs and former staffer for Senator Rand Paul. And Victoria DeFrancesco, she's a lecturer at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. Brian, I'll start with you. I think you heard the darkness that Philip Rucker of the Washington Post was describing there just a moment ago. What's your prescription for how this White House gets out of that, gets back into the light?
Policy. One word, policy. I think you get back into the light by pushing policy and pushing ideas and getting Congress to work in this transportation bill, try and figure out something on the Second Amendment to make sure that if you do pass something, you don't infringe on freedoms. Look at DACA, still an issue that's out there. You've got a number of issues out there. You've got Congress trying to deal with yet another potential government shutdown at the end of this month because they have not finished their appropriations bills for the year. So this whole idea of I almost feel like MSNBC is becoming TMZ because we're talking so much about these controversies and who's going to leave, who's going to stay, what happened with Hope Hicks. It's interesting, but ultimately the American people care more about policy than all of these scandals.
Shots fired by Brian Darling. Let me turn to you, Victoria. I mean, on the subject of policy, there's policy in the presentation of it. And let's take trade as the jumping off point for this. You had the president announcing some policy last week. It just seemed pretty inchoate. We didn't know much about it. What do you make of the way that was presented?
Well, I think, first of all, he is being good to his supporters. When he was on the campaign trail, both in 2015 when he announced and 2016, aside from talking about the wall, he was talking about trade, about bringing jobs back to the United States. So this is very much in sync with that 30% base that has consistently supported him. And within all of this chaos that we've been talking about, that is a safe space that he can return to. But it's a head scratcher. It really doesn't have any foreign policy implications. Like in theory, it's targeted toward China, but China isn't one of our main competitors when it comes to steel. That's more Canada, Mexico, South Korea. And finally, at the end of the day, jobs are lost. We saw it with the 2002 tariffs Bush put into place. We've seen it historically. So maybe we save a couple of jobs in terms of the steel industry, but we're going to lose many more jobs in terms of retail and also the costs that we as the consumers are going to be paying. So it's a head scratcher in terms of policy, but it makes perfect sense in terms of speaking to that base and shoring up that support.
Brian, I can't be the only one here who's lost the narrative. There was talk of going to gun policy, and then you have Senator Mitch McConnell saying, it's not going to happen. We're going to move on to banking policy. In the State of the Union, you had the president talking about infrastructure. Nobody's talking about infrastructure anymore. Whose job is it to set those policy priorities, to come up with that agenda and to stick to it?
Ultimately, it is a president, but Congress has done a very poor job of implementing the policies that President Trump once implemented. We saw that with repeal and replace of Obamacare. Congress fell down flat in their face trying to do that. On the tax cuts, the tax reform, they did pass a tax reform bill. That was a good thing. But on the issue of transportation and the fact they can't do any of their appropriation bills on time, and every month we have a government shutdown controversy, Congress is a problem, and Congress is hurting the president right now because they're incompetent and they're not getting stuff done.
Victoria, let's look at the Democrats here and what they're able to do or what they want to do at this point. When it comes to gun policy, say, is there a coherent message from the Democrats on gun policy?
I do. I think we're starting to see that. And I think that more than anything, it's going to help in the 2018 election. I think in terms of what Congress is going to do in the next couple of months, I don't think anything's going to happen. But I think that the momentum is there, that Democrats are coalescing and saying, we are going to do something, and this has been the tipping point. So I think in the short term, we're probably not going to see anything in terms of the Democrats getting a win on gun control. But I think if the House flips in 2018, that's when we see the real possibility of gun control.
Brian, we're spending a lot of time today talking about trade policy. Let me take a broader view of that in terms of what we saw in terms of reaction from Republicans to that announcement from the president. It is a pretty rare thing. I don't think we've seen it in such fine focus to have the president announce a policy decision in the way he did and see so many members of his own party say it's something they disagreed with or disapproved of. What does that tell you about that relationship between the White House and the Republicans, the members of his party he needs to pass policy?
Well, I think it tells you that this is a Trump policy that's non-traditional. I mean, obviously, when you're talking about imposing tariffs and pushing tariffs on China and possibly starting a trade war, that is not something Republicans have traditionally been pushing. But the president has campaigned on this. I mean, he campaigned on getting us out of these trade agreements. He got us out of the Pan-Pacific Trade Agreement, Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement. He's threatened to reform NAFTA. He's pulled us out of a bunch of international agreements, including the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So if you look at, he's been consistent with what he campaigned on, but I'm shocked that Democrats aren't jumping up and applauding these tariffs because they supported him when President Obama implemented tariffs, and this is something that Democrats have supported for a long time. But the big interesting thing is that you have Gary Cohn and his own administration pushing against these tariffs, and maybe it's time for the president to get people in his administration who actually agree with his policies.
Victoria, I just want you to comment on that as well. And there were a few Democrats here who said they were in favor of something like this, by far a minority within the Democratic Party. But what do you make here? What is the way that this was announced say to you about the policy direction of this White House?
Well, the policy direction of this White House is, it changes day to day, week to week. But I think he has been, if anything, he has been consistent in the messaging of what he put forward during his campaign. So in terms of the protectionism aspect and also in terms of the border wall. So those are the main themes that he has. Everything else, we don't know where he's going. And then you lop on top of all of that the chaos of the Mueller investigation. So, if anything, this administration is constantly playing defense, so it doesn't have much of an opportunity to play offense in terms of putting forward policy that it wants to see completed in Congress.
All right, Brian Darling, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Victoria, I'm going to have you stay with us. We're going to talk Texas politics here a couple of days out ahead of that primary in your home state. Stay with us if you would. And Robert Mueller's probe widens. There's a